Hello, welcome to Clickbait. I'm Matt and this is an old camera. If you'd like to get into all mechanical photography, 35mm, no batteries required, you could drop £5,000 on a Leica, or you could go on eBay and spend 50 quid on a Chinon CX, if you can find one. Today I'm talking about my first proper camera. This little Chinon CX was given to me by my granddad when he upgraded to a Nikon, which I think is actually, oops, this Nikon, an F801. So he used it for quite a long time. These cameras were introduced in 1974 and I believe this one dates from 1975, which makes it about 45 years old. So it's bearing up quite well. In case you hadn't heard of Chinon, and I wouldn't blame you if you hadn't, they're a Japanese camera manufacturer who date back to 1948 and currently I believe are a subsidiary of Kodak, making sort of small fun digital cameras and that kind of thing. But in the mid-70s they were turning out these fairly solid film cameras as kind of an own brand for shops like in the UK, the Dixon's high street chain, and in America the Argos brand, or Argus I think it was. Now this, the CX, is a development of an earlier camera called the CM. And what do you get for your money? Well, you basically get a fairly high spec knockoff of a Pentax K1000. Now in the early 70s there wasn't a long list of optional extras you could put onto a 35mm camera. Autofocus and exposure modes weren't really a thing just yet, certainly not on the high street. But this, for its time, was fairly well spec. As well as the obvious things like a wind on and a shutter release, your shutter speeds go up to 1/1000 of a second. You have multiple exposures with this little switch here. You've got a self-timer. You have a switchable meter. So you can frame and focus your image here, push this little button down here on the side of the lens, and then suddenly your light meter comes into play. And you can get it in focus. Now this is a really basic light meter. It's just a plus and a minus with a needle that moves up and down. When it's in the right approximate area, it's in the middle. It's an old selenium style thing. So the only battery this camera needs is one single watch type cell. It was an old mercury cell, but these days you can't get them anymore. But what you can get is a little brass ring, and it'll take a modern lithium one. So keep on working. But even without that, you can take a fairly accurate guess at what your light readings are going to be. But then you've got other such magical features as a Hotsho, so any flash in manual mode, not just the Chinon ones from the 1970s, will fire with this. You also have X and M sync flash, so if you have other systems of flash, like a cable flash to a mechanical thing like a METS or something, plug it in the X sync and away you go. You have a battery check light. Posh, huh? But one of the big selling points of this camera is the lens mount. Being a knockoff of a Pentax K1000, it takes Pentax M42 screw-fit lenses, which means lenses are really cheap. Go on eBay, you can find these things for under a tenner. And that's everything from wide-angle lenses to telephotos, all very, very cheap indeed. So if you're looking to get into mechanical photography, like old-fashioned 35mm with a solid built camera, this is a really cheap way in. Looking on eBay, you can pick up a decent one of these for 50 quid. But the kit lens it came with was good as well. It's a 50mm, but because it's manual focus, it's a nice bright one. It's an f1.4. That's really bright by today's standards and be quite an expensive thing if it's a Nikon or a Canon or a Sony, but this is just what came with the camera. And the model that followed this actually dropped the M42 mount because Pentax did as well. Well, as soon as Pentax moved over to the K bayonet mount, so did Chinon, because it meant there was plenty of lenses readily available for it. Now, as I say, this thing is solid. I mean, I don't know what the weight of this thing is. It's got to be more than a kilo. It's weighty. I think it's all brass underneath this sort of shiny metal body. But after my granddad used this for like 25 years, I then learnt photography on it for about 10 years, and then I lent it to a friend who used it a bit, and it sat on a shelf. And as it turned about kind of 40 years old, I thought it'd be fun to use it again. So I took it to my regular camera repair guy, who just stripped it down, refreshed the grease in it, and it worked. Nothing was broken, nothing was seized. It just had old, dried up grease in the gears, and the thing works beautifully again now. In fact, there's a roll of FP4 in there right now, which I'm going to go and develop as soon as I finish filming this. So what's so great about a camera like this? Well, apart from the fact it's virtually indestructible, and if someone tries to mug you when you're actually out taking photos, you can probably beat them to death with it. So in terms of that, it's quite handy. But apart from the meter, which is, to be honest, a little bit vague, it's center weighted and easily fooled by light and dark surfaces, so it's really more of a guide than a really accurate thing. It does nothing for you. You have to choose everything yourself. You have to learn the exposure triangle, the relationship between ISO, shutter speed and aperture. Then you get to learn what the effect of a fast or slow shutter speed on a picture will be, and you get to learn what the aperture does to a picture in terms of depth of field. So It's a really great learning curve. It's the kind of camera everyone should learn on, even if you're fairly experienced with photography. It's nice sometimes to just go back to absolute basics, put a roll of film in something and walk around knowing you've only got 24 or 36 pictures, not a limitless supply that you can delete if you don't like them. Make everyone count. Make yourself think about every shot, because every shot is costing you a few pennies, or maybe even more than a few pennies, depending what film you're running through the thing. If it's some nice slide film, it can be quite expensive, and black and white film is fairly cheap. I mean, a roll of FP4 is about £3, and then the chemicals aren't too expensive, and if you can develop it in the sink at home, which will be another video coming shortly. Everything on it is very heavy. It does feel crude and solid. Like there's quite smooth focus ring, but the crank up there actually is quite hard on your thumb, and the clunk from one shutter speed to the next is again solid. You can feel the mechanism working inside. This feels like a machine. It feels like something very solid, but that solidity is also one of its greatest features. This is a camera that will never die. After the bomb drops, the cockroaches will be driving Volvos and taking photos on these. For cockroaches can't afford Leicas. So I've come here somewhere picturesque and pretty to run a few pictures through on a roll of Ilford FP4, see what it's like to use a camera from, well, 45 years ago. Well, let's just say if you learned to drive an automatic Honda Jazz and were given a 1950s Ford Prefect to have a go in, you'd be in for a shock, and this is pretty much the same deal. Everything works in the same way, but you just have to think about it an awful lot more. It's in one mode, manual, because that's the only mode this thing has, but it's all very easy to use and very simple. It's all straightforward because there aren't layers and menus and things to get lost in. It's all just right in front of you. There's your aperture, there's your shutter speed. You look through, you find the, or turn the light meter on, balance the needle, and you're done. Turn the light meter off again, and you're looking straight through at f1.4. And bear in mind, this is a prime lens, and most lenses were back in the 70s prime lenses. Because you're focusing manually, they tend to be quite fast. This is a real budget lens. It's an f1.4. Now focusing is nice and easy thanks to that lovely split screen ground glass viewfinder focusing screen, which means that you can really dial in the focus nice and quick and easy. If you only ever use digital cameras, you won't necessarily be aware how nice and easy it is to use a manual focus lens with a split screen focusing window, because it just drops into focus. You can see the change between the two halves of the circle. Just click and you're in focus. So it's nice and fast and simple. Now, in terms of handling though, you've not got the big grip to make it nice and comfortable for your hand and ergonomic for your fingers. And the way everything moves, it's very heavy. It's like a real clunk, clunk, clunk. It's got a real kind of Soviet feel about it. And you can kind of feel almost the clockwork inside winding up as you move to the faster and faster shutter speeds. So you get above 125th, 250th for the second. It's not more of an effort to do it, but you can just feel tension in the thing. Now I've got a roll of film in here, and I won't waste any shots, because when you're shooting on a roll of film, you have to remember every shot is at a premium. So I'm going to balance that down, get a bit of depth of field, shooting with those little bits of purple flower in the foreground. So I'm down to about F11 there. Focus on them, got the river behind. Drop the shutter speed down, don't forget to wind on, obviously. Clunk, that's a proper mechanical clunk. This is the great thing with this camera though, there's only one battery in this, but that's just for the light meter. So if you had an idea of what the light roughly was, I mean most things around f5.6, 125th, give or take, you're going to be okay with. Certainly with black and white film, you've got a lot of leeway there. You can use this purely on mechanical means. So you wind that up, that's clockwork, or spring powered for the shutter, that's spring powered for the shutter speed, the mechanical aperture, manual focus. There is no option of a motor drive on this thing. So you're always going to be working as fast as your thumb can crank, and as fast as you can move back into focus as you change the position and reframe the image. This is the camera I learned to use the exposure triangle on, balancing the aperture and the shutter and the ISO. Well, the ISO is fixed though because it's film, unless you're going to go into push processing, which is a whole other dark art, which is more or less forgotten these days. And one thing you do have to remember with this is that once you push the light meter button down, everything goes dark because it closes the aperture in real time, because that's how it works. It's not metered off the lens or metered off anything clever. It's literally the light coming in and falling on the sensor, telling you whether the needle is too high or too low. So you have to make sure you get it in focus before you hit that, because once it's all dark, it is actually quite a lot harder to focus the thing. You've got to sort of rethink your workflow a little bit. But it is crazy to think this camera, which I learnt to use so many years ago, is actually, well, 1975 I think this camera is, or 74, this particular one I mean. It's like 6 years older than the film this t-shirt's referencing, and this is an old film. Okay, so I just tried to shoot the same picture on the Z6, which I'm filming on, and on this as well. But of course, with the Z6 on the tripod, it's got the luxury of a zoom lens, so I was able to just crank it back to about 35mm and just take in the whole scene just a little bit more widely and just get a bit more of the reflection in the water, which I wasn't able to do with this because it's fixed on a 50. I had to go and stand a little further back. But that's one of the great things, in a way. It forces you to do things manually and more thoughtfully. You can't just, oh, I'm not quite right, I'll just tweak the zoom. You've got to think about where else you can position yourself, how else you can achieve the same photo. Right, it's hot out here. I'm going to go inside for a cup of tea and finish up talking about this thing on the sofa. Right, so I'm back from the river, and it was nice taking a few photos with this. I will develop this film later on today and see how they came out. Hopefully there aren't too many light leaks in this because it's an old camera and I've not changed the seals, so fingers crossed that looks good. If I've enticed you to go and find yourself a Chinon CX, I would suggest looking on eBay, because that's probably the only place you will find one these days. If you can't find one, a Pentax K1000 is virtually the same. It doesn't have quite as many features, but they are plentiful and they are also very cheap. If you fancy something a bit posher but also has a good range of lenses, then maybe go check out something like a Nikon EM or a Nikon FM, or they're going to cost quite a lot more, or a Canon AE1 or a Canon A1. Something like that would be an awful lot of fun and also give you access to a lot of lenses as well. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you again soon on Clickbait. Now get shooting.